Please welcome Robert Gipe. Are you there, Robert? Come on out. Robert Gipe, Amy Greene, Charles Dodd White, and Glenn Taylor.
There's an older model blue Volvo in the back parking lot with Bourbon County tags with its headlights on.
There's an older model Volvo with what plates, Wes? Bourbon County plates with its lights on. So you may want to check that. I'll leave it to Robert Gipe, who will moderate this session.
How y'all doing out there? Welcome to the symposium. So we're up here and we're supposed to talk about riding in the new millennium, as if we had any choice, right? And so we thought we'd start off because some of y'all, we're getting close to that time where people just have lived in the one millennium. See, all of us up here, we've lived in two different millennia. And so we remember, man, we didn't think there was going to be a second new millennium, right? And Y2K in 1999, it was going to be all over, right? It was like it's going to be 1999, and then it was going to be nothing. So, Amy, I'm going to let Amy start because you said you were ready, right?
I did. I was so ready. I had stockpiled canned goods and water, and I have to admit, I was a little disappointed when the apocalypse didn't come.
Right.
I still expect somebody to answer for it. It's like,
Right.
why was there no Y2K disaster?
I had this friend, Lisa Frith. She thought that the whole Y2K phenomenon was something that was cooked up by the grocery stores to get. So that's why the Kroger closed in Harlan, was because Y2K, they bought up all the stuff and they couldn't get any more food, and that's why we lost our Krogers. Which, Charles, did you have any memories of the time?
Well, I was still in the military in '99, so I was driving a tank, so I was ready for whatever was going to happen.
Like a tank full of canned goods, right?
Well, sure.
That
Or
is
you could
such a
take somebody
comfort.
else's canned goods. So.
Oh, okay.
Glenn, what do you got?
I wish I could say I was driving a tank, but I was. I had just moved to Austin, gotten married July 3rd, 1999, moved to Austin, Texas, and my Uncle Sleaze, who's my godfather, gave us a giant inflatable penis, which we put in the window for New Year's Eve to welcome the new millennium.
And that's what, back in the last millennium, we like to call partying like it's 1999. Well, good. Well, so now you see what you're dealing with.
This is what you got?
And so I think we'd like now to give everybody a chance to hear what people have been writing. So if y'all don't mind, we'll read a couple minutes. Who wants to start? I'm going last because I ain't picked nothing out yet.
You want to go the opposite way, and I'll start down
Yeah,
here?
let's do that.
Okay, real quick. So I was thinking yesterday, listening to people talk about strong Appalachian women, because strangely the name Margaret is always coming up for me. My wife's name is Margaret. Listening to Frank X. Walker talk yesterday, my favorite poem of his is called Matriarch, and it's about, I believe, his grandmother, whose name was Margaret. And then on this video, in which Denise Jardina is one of my favorite people on it, it's called West Virginia. It came out on PBS years ago. There's a woman on there named Margaret Hatfield, who was from Mingo County, West Virginia, where my dad is from, and she has one of my favorite quotes, and that was, she says, Appalachian women, you couldn't kill them with a hammer. That's what she says. And she even has another one where she says something like, it seemed like they were quiet around their husbands, but it didn't take long if you hung out with them to see who crowed and who laid the eggs. And so I thought I'd read just a few paragraphs here about a woman in my latest book, A Hanging at Cinder Bottom, which takes place in Cinder Bottom and Keystone in McDowell County. I won't say MacDowell like Denise because I'm not from there. You have to be from there to say MacDowell. But Goldie Toothman is the name of this woman, and she is a madam at a house of ill fame. And she is certainly a strong woman, so I'll just read to you a little piece here that takes place in 1910, where she's walking in Keystone, West Virginia. In town, Goldie walked with purpose down Railroad Avenue. The sun had moved free of the mountain and set up overhead. Two men who looked to be railroad brass stepped into an alleyway, their stiff hat brims pulled low, heads tucked. She knew what they were looking for. In a patch of dirt next to the Union Political and Social Club, a black dog was rope-tied to a chunk of brick chimney. It was a sizable ruin, big as a rich man's grave marker. The chimney had toppled in a fire the year before and was left in pieces where it fell. The dog's tongue moved forward and back as if on a timer. It whined with each pant. There was not a water bowl or a puddle of rainwater to be found, nor was there an inch of shade, as every tree in downtown Keystone had long since met its end, some by fire, some by flood, and some by tooth of saw. Goldie freed the rough length of rope from the brick's sharp red edge and pulled the skinny dog across the dirt. When she stepped inside the heavy door of the bar room, nobody paid much mind. There was a card game in the corner where men mumbled low and angry. A girl no more than 14 sat on the lap of a bearded man whose eyes were nearly shut and whose hands hung dead at his sides. "Which one of you does this animal belong to?" Goldie shouted. All gave attention, save the half-conscious drunk with the 2 young whore on his knee. Chief Rutherford sat on a stool at the end of the long bar. He's a bad guy, by the way, Chief Rutherford. He'd taken off his gun belt and hung it on the stool next to him. He ate his customary noon plate of pickled eggs prepared by Taffy Reed. "That's my dog," he said. He stumbled when he stepped off his stool. He wiped his hands on his shirt and walked slow toward where she stood by the door. When he was close enough, Goldie said, "He had neither water nor shade out there in the yard." Rutherford snorted away the drip on his lip and smiled. "Well, I reckon he don't mind long as a peach like you wanders by to save him." He looked her up and down and shook his head in slow disbelief that a woman so beautiful could be stuck in the bowel of McDowell. "Matter of fact," he went on, "I believe when I put him out there on that rock, I was setting bait for the likes of you." She smiled back at him. Goldie leaned down, put her lips at Rutherford's malformed ear, and whispered, "If I see that dog tied again without water or shade, I'll knot his lead around your tackle sack and throw a pork chop in the road." Thank you. Thank you.
Go for it, man.
That's great. I've been looking forward to that book since I saw that it was going to be published, so it's great to hear it in person. I'm going to read a little bit from my book, Shelter of Others, which is set in western North Carolina in the contemporary age, but a lot of it is about looking into the past. And while most of it's in third person, the brief section that I'm going to read from is first person, from the mind of someone who's suffering dementia. So you get to see the idea of the past merging with the present. Go to the waters to make all things new into nothing, to make found things lost again. The location of time is to be found within this slivering, this conversation of ice and current. The recognition of memory will be dug up from river bottoms, clawed free of the old burials, and you and I will coil like serpents in the tall grass, tongues seeking the truth of what we were and what we will become. I knew the woods as a boy. They were my prophets. The language of elms and thickets filled my ears with their botany, and it was a song unmatched. I sketched these things and what they spoke, recorded the living shape of trunks, tangles, and boughs, met their divinity with my notion of them, poorly translated by the arts of charcoal illustration and sentimental verse. A poor artist, perhaps, but a sincere one, a simple but good instrument in God's willing hand. My father loved me. He showed me the cemeteries where his people rested. He took me there and held the butcher paper against the face of their tombstones while I drew the charcoal pencil gently across, resurrecting lost names beneath my hand. The soft texture of what I was bound to inherit from them blackened my skin. It would not wash easily away. I would carry the smudge for the rest of the day, laying the edge of my hand against any newly cleaned or polished thing, imprinting my surroundings with what I'd stolen from the dead. Before our life in the wilderness, he worked as a machinist. His job was in Knoxville, and we moved there when I was a child, still short of schooling age. Despite my youth, I do remember some things. The silver purling of the Tennessee River in winter, the reek of the wharf, an old man with gold teeth and an impossibly small monkey who would take a nickel from any passerby to strike the poor squalling creature with a ball-peen hammer. My father would never give me a nickel, though I begged him, wanting to see the razored mouth swing open in a moment of dumb pain. My mother and I lived in a boarding house during the week while my father worked 12-hour shifts and slept in a worker's dormitory he would never let me see. The single room where we lived was small and overheated by a radiator that ticked as regular as rain against the roof. My mother was a quiet woman with a young face despite burying me when she was middle-aged. Her hair was the color of sunlit ice, but she was all the more lovely for her matured prettiness. I remember walking with her and clutching her hand when we would pass strange men in the streets who would let their gazes linger. My fingers would become demanding of her palms if I did not feel her reciprocal squeeze, until finally she would laugh and pull me against her, calling me her prize boy, and promising the world held no eyes of favor for her but mine and my father's. Even then, the sound of her voice was a balm. It stayed me. I would weep to hear it now. Thanks.
I'm looking to the moderator who's in charge. He's supposed to tell me it's my turn.
And now, Miss Amy Greene.
Thank you. Thank you. Must have an introduction. I feel kind of bad because this is supposed to be writing the new millennium, and this book takes place during the Depression, which is probably something we should address. Like, why do we keep writing about the past? But it takes place in the Tennessee Valley during the Great Depression, and it's about the displacement when the TVA dams flooded the Tennessee Valley. And I'll just read you a couple of pages from the book. There's this, can you all hear me? Maybe you couldn't hear me before. Now you can, okay. And in this little excerpt I'm going to read, there's this sort of Greene TVA caseworker who's come to talk this dangerous woman into giving up her land. If I can find it, hold on. Washburn started for the porch, but paused when he saw her, already standing there with a dog at her side, as if she'd been waiting, as if she had watched him come. He didn't know how he had failed to notice her there on his way up the track. She seemed to have materialized. What startled him even more than her waiting presence was how little she resembled the farm wife he'd been picturing. She was around his age, in her early 20s. It was her bearing that struck him most, how straight she stood, unlike most of the women in Unita, with their backs curved over their sunken bellies. He shaded his eyes against the sun and looked up at her. She towered over him. His first instinct was to turn and go back to the car. There was no way to do what was asked of him. She would not be moved. He glanced around, hoping her husband was at home. He had read the reports, but nothing prepared him. Something about her fierceness made her beautiful. It was an effort to cross the neglected grass and approach the porch. Its whitewashed posts drifted over with soot. He had already made it farther than the other caseworker without being shot at and forced himself to keep going. Then he saw the gun propped by the front door, and his confidence faltered. It took gumption to set his foot on the bottom step. When the dog began to bark, the woman laid her hand on its broad reddish head to hush it. Washburn's mouth was dry as he climbed the steps. Standing across from Annie Clyde Dodson, he realized she wasn't as tall as she'd seemed, but she was no less intimidating. She didn't reach for the rifle. She only looked at him. He'd thought her eyes were brown, but now, closer up, he saw they were hazel. She wore men's shoes and a faded shift. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and high cheekbones. He was about to speak when a sound came from the open window behind her, like a child crying out in its sleep. The woman glanced over her shoulder, and when the cry didn't come again, her eyes settled back on Washburn. Annie Clyde Dodson? Yes. He extended his hand. My name's Sam Washburn. How do you do? I'm tired, she said. He dropped his hand. I know you're just doing your job, but you're not welcome here. But I came a long way to talk to you. She studied him down to his polished shoes. Well, you wasted a trip. He hesitated, choosing his words. He decided to be direct with her. If you're not gone by the 1st of August, you'll be evicted. I'm asking you to hear me out before it comes to that. Y'all say the same things, she said. I don't need to hear it again. He lifted his hat and scratched beneath it. He didn't know what else to do with himself. The problem is all this rain we've had. It's dangerous to stay here with the reservoir rising. Then I guess you better get on back to Knoxville. Washburn's cheeks colored. I understand your feelings. I grew up on a farm like yours. This is not my farm, she said. I have a little girl. It belongs to her. He cleared his throat. Yes, well, do you want her to see you dragged off in handcuffs? The Dodson woman's eyes caught fire. That's exactly what I want. I want her to see it and never forget it. I want her to know that I fought for what was hers. They fell silent, facing each other. There was no sound but the churring cicadas and the panting dog. Washburn wondered if she'd reach for the Winchester beside the door, but she kept still. He groped for more to say. She had confused him, made him doubt his reason for being there. Then the noise came again from the house, a child sleepy crying. Some of the fierceness went out of Annie Clyde Dodson. There was a sag in her posture. He stared, unable to help himself, at the freckle on her collarbone, the tendril tucked behind her ear. He saw how thin she was, her cheeks hollow and the neck of her shift bagging. He could almost feel the weight of her weariness on his own chest. He took a pace backward and then wavered. After 2 years, he still felt like he was proving himself. He didn't want the chief to doubt his competence. More than that, it was humbling to have his authority undermined by a woman of his own age. But she had the soul of one much older. It was clear that he wouldn't be able to sway her. She was right. He had wasted a trip. When he got to the office, he would start the eviction paperwork. The thought made him uncomfortable, as if he had spoken it out loud. He found himself leaving without being told. She didn't have to point her rifle. But as he backed down the steps, the child's cries drifting after him, his eyes played a trick. Somehow the glare of the sun and the shade of the porch made him think he saw water running down the Dodson woman's face. Not pouring on her, but pouring from her, seeping between the fullness of her lips, spouting from her lids to mat her lashes, flowing from the roots of her hair and soaking her dress. The image lasted only until he blinked, but it stayed with him all the way back to Knoxville. Driving away, he was glad to be done with her in the town of Unita. He didn't know then how soon he would see her again. Thank you.
That's some pretty good smack right there, isn't it? It just occurred to me that this book of mine is set in 1999, so I'm not even in this millennium either. So let's read it anyway, as long as we're up here. Is that on? Can y'all hear it all right? I walked out the door like I was leaving for good. That's always how I felt when I went out in the snow. It was my favorite thing about snow. Houston wasn't at his house, and I put a pint jar in my hoodie pocket and headed up on the ridge. The trees against the snow-white sky were like words on paper. I tried to read what they said in a beautiful, mystical nature language that no one could understand but me. They said for me to kiss their ass. I am not a nature girl, see? I don't camp, I don't fish, I can't tell which animals are which by their poop. I just wander the woods, all by myself. The snow squeaked under my feet. I lost my breath when the way got steep. I sat down on a boulder and sipped from the jar, corn liquor, made by some ancient craft. The children I was going to have or not have danced at the edge of my eyes. When I turned my head towards them, they were gone. I didn't think about Denny, who's her coal miner cousin, and I didn't think about Keith Kelly, who's this guy that's a coal miner that hates her. Till this year, I thought you was a boy. That's what the only boy who ever said he liked me said the first time he got me by myself. I sipped from the jar. Mama, I said in my head. What, she said in my head. In my head, I said, remind me what I'm missing doing homeschool. In my head, Mama laughed. Ha, ha, ha. I got drunk in the snow on a narrow patch of land Mama owned, held deep, heaven high, no divided mineral. Do you know what I mean? Fuck you if you don't. Do you remember what it was like to be 15? Do you know what it's like to grow up in Kentucky? Either you do or you don't. Ain't no use explaining if you don't. Fuck you. I moved through the snow. I wished I had a dog with me. I turned to see if one of Houston's dogs followed me. I took out the jar again so as not to think about what it meant that not one of Houston's dogs followed me. Snow and trees gave way to snow and rocks as I climbed. Fresh, I said to myself. Everything was fresh. Maybe, the wind said to my face, maybe you should cut yourself off on that liquor. I sat on a rock at the crest of the ridge and exhaled. Everything to the north of us sprawled out in front of me. Cut yourself off, I said to the wind. I took out the pipe and the pouch. I did not have a lighter. I didn't have fire. I stood up to kill myself. I looked down. There was a ledge 10 feet below. I could jump down on that to practice kill myself. I jumped off the mountain. I'll tell you something weird about moderating a panel in the new Millennium. I look down to see what time it is, and there's already like tweets out there on what we're saying up here. That's just weird and new millennial.
You should read those. That's what we should do.
I'm not going to
That'd
read
be like
that
the New
stuff.
Age
They'd
panel.
say whatever they want. So while Amy was talking a minute ago, a question occurred to me, and actually it's because she said it. Why do we keep writing about the past?
You want me to go first? Let's see if I can do this in a roundabout way that allows me to say what I really want to say and ignore Robert's question.
Big future in politics, or Mr. Taylor.
Well, okay, so yeah, so much to say, but on the heels of hearing that, and I don't know how many people have read Trampoline yet, and so I don't want to ruin things for people who haven't, but the book blew me away. And at one point, you know, Don Jewell, who you just heard from, speaking of strong young women in this case from the region, she, you know, kind of has a little brush with the governor. And, you know, after I read it, I was like, we need to get to the real governor of Kentucky. Somebody in here can do it and make Trampoline required reading for all high school students in the state. Because it... And so here's how I'll talk about now. And I'll say just a little bit, and that is that when I read an advanced reader copy of that book, it actually was after I had finished writing this book, and all three of my novels take place in the past, and I had already been thinking about moving away from that, and then when I read Trampoline, it just kind of reinforced that. I think I'm ready to write about the now, and it has a lot to do with that book, because you can't read about someone like Don Jewell and not see her everywhere you go afterwards. So for instance, and I'll say this and then I'll just not try not to go too far off topic, but my wife drives my oldest son to middle school most every day because I'm not an early morning person and he has to be there at 7. But some days I drive him, and I had heard about this one girl who stands on the corner of West Virginia Avenue and Mississippi Avenue. That's not a joke. Those are the two cross streets, waiting for her bus in First Ward in Morgantown, West Virginia, where we live. And so on the few days when I drag my lazy ass out of bed and take my oldest son to school, I had heard of this girl from my wife, and there she is every day, and she's standing on the corner. Reese doesn't know her name, but she's in 8th grade. This was last year. He was in 6th grade. And every day she has on the same pair of pants, and they are black jeans with bones on them. You know the bone outfits where you have a whole skeleton in bright white on your black clothing. Well, she has on the bone pants every day, and she has pink hair some days, purple hair some days, and every day without fail she's smoking a cigarette at 7 o'clock in the morning. And so we called her Smokey McBone Pants. That's what we called her every day. And it occurred to me while I was reading Trampoline that that we were kind of laughing and saying, oh, isn't that sad that she's smoking, and she's only in 8th grade, she shouldn't be smoking at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well, then I was reading about Don Jewel, and Smokey McBone Pants to me became a lot more than a funny, name and something to talk about. She became someone who, as I'm always telling my middle son, because he never looks up at anybody or sees the world around him, he's always got his nose in a book, which I guess is a good thing, but I always tell him, look around you. Everybody has whole worlds inside them. And so I think a character like Don Jewel, and I think if any of us were to now write about the new millennium, as our title says, it would be to achieve that. I think sometimes it's easier, for me at least, to write about the past because I don't have to deal with all the bad stuff that's happening in my home state and in my hometown of Huntington, West Virginia, and in a lot of other places. Writing about the past, and the boom times, for instance, like this book, allows me to just say, well, I think I'm not going to deal with that right now, and I'm going to go back to the better times, but I think I'm ready to make a little change. Does that make sense? I don't know. You don't have to clap.
Let me ask these other two the same question. Maybe they'll be a little more to the point. So, Charles, Amy, y'all don't much write about the good old days. It's pretty rough back then too. So, could you all speak to what does it mean to be a contemporary writer looking back?
Yeah, I think it's it's important to think about it. My first book was set back in the past, historical, and the last one was contemporary. But even the books that can be set in the past can very much be about the present. If any of you know, the British writer Pat Barker did the Regeneration trilogy about World War I, and she said she actually started out her career writing kind of these working class, kind of, for lack of a better word, British Larry Brown kind of stories, and she became known and had this attachment as a working class writer, and she wanted to maybe kind of broaden her concerns a little bit. And she talked about writing historical fiction or writing in the past as it's a back door into the present. And I really like that idea of being able to disguise what can be addressed, because too often some of our most salient concerns, you might turn off a readership if it's contemporarily set because of the knee-jerk reactions that are inherent in anything. I guess this kind of harkens back to one of the discussions yesterday about the role of the political in fiction particularly. So for me, when I sat down and wrote that book, it was about a guy coming back from World War I and kind of what he brought back with him and how his home had changed. I was writing that in 2009, 2010, and I was obviously very aware of a lot of people coming back from the Middle East. So for me, that was a way to kind of explore those ideas in a way that, I was in the military, but I was in the peacetime military, and I always felt like I'd be a bit of a counterfeit if I tried to write about combat in this time period. Whereas the historical gives you a little bit more leeway, and I was able to feel at home with that a little bit.
Okay, Amy, you kind of went backwards. First to second novel. You want to talk about?
I did.
That
Well,
path?
yeah, the first novel was sort of this multi-generational story, and I began in the Depression and moved up, to contemporary. So I did touch on contemporary issues, but I feel like that what's happened before in the past here is so relevant to what is happening now. So, what I've discovered is that I'm telling the story of a place with my body of work. I didn't set out to do that, but I kind of realized that that's what's happening. Is there feedback? It's okay But, the TVA and the dams led to industrialization here. So my third novel is about a chemical spill and the factories. And so it kind of felt like a bridge almost. It felt like, to write about contemporary Appalachia felt like the natural next step. But I felt like, and looking back, I feel like I had to touch on what led to this moment. And what's happening right now in my neck of the woods in East Tennessee is that we're kind of this toxic dumping ground for the factories because, we're desperate for jobs and they know we'll take it. So they come and they poison our groundwater. And so, the dams were a blessing and a curse to us because the TVA did great things for us, but then we're sort of suffering a consequence, So I think it's really important to look back for that reason because we can see, well, why is this happening right now? Why can't my parents drink out of their well? And you can kind of look backward and see, well, those were the steps that led to, this eventuality. So that's why I feel like it's really, really important to take a close look at the past, to put a spotlight on it before we can move forward.
I don't know when you're the moderator. Robert, what do you think of that? Well,
Okay, I will moderate you. How about that?
No, I'm good.
Robert, what do you think?
Well, let me tell you, Amy.
Okay. Tell me.
I teach at a community college in Harlan, Kentucky, and we do a lot of oral history work. And it's and I've been there for 18 years, and it's we're moving into the period. When I first came there, it's like almost every student had daily contact with somebody who had direct experience with the beginning of coal mining, which began in Harlan County in 1911, 1912. And so, that there were grandparents or there were great-grandparents who, as children, had lived through that period. And earlier, even than that, there were people who had been adults in that period. And so it's like Faulkner said, the past wasn't dead, it wasn't even past. And that in fact, I thought that, this is one of the things that when I came from East Tennessee, where we're upriver in Kingsport pouring all kinds of the stuff that she's worried about into the, we've been generating material for Amy Greene's next novel since 1920 in Kingsport.
Thanks for that.
But one of the things that struck me was that it was a living continuity. And I think that excerpt I read, Dawn kind of speaks to that a lot. I remember when I was working at Apple Shop, Carolyn Sturgill was a strong woman from Big Cowan and very much tied in with the traditional culture of the community. And she always used to talk about what a watered-down version of her mother she was. I'm just watered down. I'm just a lot weaker version of what she was. And, and I think that and I tried to have that play out in this character, this sense that we're getting watered down and what that means and it's like as we move into one of the things I'm getting into, I'm still working on a second novel, but I do, this is an interesting, I was thinking about this, I was talking about narrative situation, that Dawn's not 15 when she's telling this story, I think she's 21, I don't exactly know, but she's looking back, as a young person looking back on when she was a kid, and that's just because so much of my experience comes from oral history, which is, even if people are talking about yesterday, it's looking back. And really, I guess it's hard not. That reminds me, it's like one of the things. That'll be my next question. All right. So, Robert, you need to wrap up. We've only got a few minutes left. Okay, thank you, Robert. Oh wait, sorry. But anyway, I guess that's the point. So my next question would be, Dick read a real interesting piece from the end of an essay by Ann Pancake yesterday, in which she was talking about describing the problem, right? Which made me think of that movie where Jack Nicholson's in therapy, and he says, as good as it gets, and he comes out of the psychiatrist's office and said, "I'm over here drowning, and you're describing the water." And
That was a passable Jack Nicholson. Good
thank
job.
you. Well, it's all been leading to that. And so that Anne Pancake was in this essay had talked about the idea that she wanted to try and write something that described a brighter future, that described a way out, that might be some kind of not fantasy, but something that projected forward and told a story of things working out, of what it would look like if there was some kind of recovery. And I don't know, I don't really even have a question as far as that goes, but it's a whole different way of thinking about fiction, isn't it, than what most of us have ever done. And I just was kind of interested to hear what you guys, I don't even know what to say, but could you please react to that idea?
It took me a lot longer than the 5 hours I had predicted to get here yesterday from Morgantown, but I got here right about the time, I think I was back here right about the time Dick was reading the quote from Anne Pancake, and I couldn't hear it, and then later I asked him, and he told me he'd get it to me. But it's, has anybody read her latest, by the way, which has one of the greatest titles of all time, which is Me and My Daddy Listened to Bob Marley? That's the title of her latest. She's from Romney, West Virginia, and I think that her dedication to anti-mountaintop removal alone is commendable. And I guess that kind of, Robert's prompt there kind of fits into what I was talking about with this urge I've felt lately or this sense I've felt lately that I maybe was turning away from not just the present or the new millennium, as our panel, title is, but the future. And so I was telling folks at breakfast this morning that my sister moved. She lived in Lexington for years, she lived in Cincinnati for years, and she has moved back to our hometown of Huntington, and she has taken a job at a place called Her Place, which is a women's addiction recovery center, because we have such a profound problem with heroin right now. And so I think little things like that, and then I met a photographer through Roger May named Raymond Thompson, who's taking pictures of people who have moved back to West Virginia, and I think his initial reason was, why in the world would these people ever move back, and he wants to capture you in photographs, so he took my picture, and you have to write a little thing about why you moved back, which is hard as hell to do, I found out. You think you have all these reasons why, and then you get asked to write it down. But I told him he should take a picture of my sister as well, because she, could have stayed in Cincinnati. She could have stayed in Lexington.
She's better looking.
What's that?
She's better looking.
Yeah, she's a lot better looking. She's got a lot more hair. She's better looking, and she's actually doing something, to address the problem. She's not just writing books about, issues. She's actually doing something, and it's working, I think, and that makes me hopeful, and I guess that's a roundabout way of answering your question. I don't know if Anne's quote was necessarily that hopeful, but I kind of refuse to be too cynical and doomsday-ish about some of the issues we're facing in our region, and then what I'm trying to do is find a way on a small scale. So, for instance, I just had a reading at a bar in Morgantown called 123 Pleasant, great bar if any of you have ever been there. And I brought music in, and we had a custom T-shirt raffle. My wife Margaret does embroidery, so we had these Ace of Spades embroidered on shirts, and they said send her bottom. And for $1, you could buy a raffle ticket, and all the money went to Caritas House of Morgantown, which is an organization that helps people who are HIV and AIDS positive and homeless in Morgantown. And so I think, one way to do it is try to find ways to go out, tell people about your work as a writer, and also at the same time try and make them aware of some of the issues the communities we're now living in are facing.
Let me jump in there. We got about 3 minutes. We've got 3 minutes left, and so did want to hear Charles and Amy respond to this idea of.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just kind of follow up kind of logically where he was leading, I think. I think it's important to remember, and I appreciate what she's saying in the essay, but it is still an essay that she's writing, and it's a lot easier to deliver those types of forecasts in essays. In terms of fiction and my understanding of how it works best, I can't help but think of what Harry Crews said. I don't have the answers. I have a lot of really good questions, though. And I think that fiction turns on those questions. Otherwise, I think you do stray into writing tracks, and you sway away from the aesthetic and toward the argumentative in a way that not sure what you have when you do that. I think you're starting to write a utopia.
Right.
I don't have any answers, but I feel like in my fiction, I have this urge to focus on the natural world, and maybe that's the utopian part of where we live, just the idyllic beauty, really. And I have this idea that if we love ourselves, we won't destroy ourselves. So maybe if we write about the landscape and the intense beauty of what we've got here, then maybe we can ask readers to love it like we do, and maybe that would affect some kind of positive change. So, rather than focusing on a relentlessly negative outlook, and it does look that way sometimes, I think we ought to, maybe focus a little bit too on what we have.
Very nice. Well, listen, let's just let it go right there. Can we get a big hand for everybody up here?
Can I take your picture?
All right, you can stop now. And really, I'm guessing for most of y'all, the most exciting part of the day, of the morning, is up now, the chance to interact with the authors and buy a book. So we'll see you out in the hall.